Hey everyone, I hope you're all having a great day. We're going to talk about chapter 63 and chapter 64. Chapter 63 is on intimacy, so let's get started. So, what is intimacy? Intimacy is a close familiarity that two people share, often with an affectionate set of feelings, thoughts, and actions. Sex is a major part of intimacy, however, it's not the only part. There are many aspects to intimacy. And so, what we're going to discover in our discussion today is how the perception of intimacy changes as people age. And of course, intimacy, the desire for it doesn't change with age, or it doesn't really diminish with age, but there are some conditions and situations that make it more challenging for adults to engage in intimacy. So, regarding long term relationships, there is a natural change among couples as far as intimacy. So, for instance, intimacy can decrease due to the arrival of life challenges such as cancer, death of a family member, financial problems. There's many other aspects that can that can be challenging for a couple. Also, as people begin to age, they're out of what I call the honeymoon phase, and they're starting to focus on more responsibility and the reality of life. Taking care of their family, raising their kids, taking care of grandchildren. So passion is just kind of not, it's not non-existent, but it's just not the focus anymore. And then aging itself um, is huge because there are physical, biochemical, emotional, psychological, and many other changes that occur within the body that can make intimacy more of a challenge for people. And then another huge one is cheating. There's a lot of dishonesty and unfaithfulness among partners, and that does create a huge strain on relationships. So, believe it or not, older people date, and it is very common. And dating can be just as fun for a 65-year-old as it was a 25 years old. Now, the only difference is that there are a new set of circumstances and challenges that older people face. So, for instance, playing field is not as level. There's married couples. A lot of people are married. There's a lot of emotional, physical, societal influences that make it more difficult. Um, Also, men typically die at a younger age, so there's more women that are looking for partners. And also, some older men will date younger partners, and that's true for older women too. So, there's a lot more to fight against as an older person. Now, I put this here because caring companionship may be more essential for older men. What that means is that in the past, typically the men were typically the ones with the careers, and um, their wives would do the cooking, and um, their wives were a huge part of their lives. And so when they lost their spouse, when the men lost their spouse, oftentimes they were left with a lot of confusion about how to live their life, and they didn't really know how to cook and didn't really know how to even take care of responsibilities around the home, and that was true for my grandparents or my two grandpas. Um, and many older people may decide not to date out of loyalty for their deceased spouse or for family opinions or whatever that is. And like I said, as people age, they typically women are more, they have a fear of their appearance not being as attractive as they were, and men have a fear of not being able to perform as well physically. And obviously, older people don't typically, they're in the churches and they're in retirement communities and sporting events. So that's typically where I guess, the social interaction occurs between potential partners. And then a huge one is health. Health is a huge one. Health discourages many people from dating. So there can be intimacy without sex and sex without intimacy. There's no age in which sexual activity is inappropriate. However, typically, older relationships are less focused on the sex aspect and more focused on the companionship and the relationship part. And so Older people find hugging, kissing, sitting with someone, talking to someone just as fulfilling as as intimacy. And there are some other aspects that can make intimacy hard. For instance, children may disapprove of a new partner. Um, there's a decrease of sex hormones, which can make intimacy more challenging, more maybe even more uncomfortable. And then there's fear of sexually transmitted diseases that are present at older age too. Okay, dementia, this is a huge portion or a huge part of old age, and this does impact intimacy in many ways. As dementia worsens, it can put a strain on a couple's ability to be intimate because a person with dementia can become paranoid, they can become accusatory, they can be more demanding and aggressive, they may forget recent intercourse, which means they might demand sex more often, and they can mistake a partner for someone else or call them by a different name or call them by the name of a past lover, and that can put a strain on intimacy, and it is challenging for these people. And not only that, but it's challenging for the partner because they're having to carry the burden of the person with dementia. And so, unfortunately, dementia changes a person, and they're not exactly the same person that they were years before. And so, it is hard when it comes to intimacy because it's not quite the same. Now, family can have a huge impact on intimacy. It can be negative, it can be positive. One example is children. Children do have a huge influence on their parents' actions and decisions. And so, children might find a new partner that their mom or dad has to be a little more untrustworthy, or they fear that the financial inheritance will go to that new person. So there's some aspects to consider there. Also, children can provide support to older parents, and I personally think that children are probably one of the most important pieces of an older person's life. And so children have a huge influence. But I mean, at the end of the day, older people tend to have a lot of responsibilities, and they fear that a new relationship with a new partner will take away their time from their grandchildren and their children. So that's another reason why they may not engage in it. And then as people age, there's less opportunities to be private, to engage in the intimacy. So, for instance, nursing homes, living with a family member, these are all situations that make it harder for people to do this. Okay, so chapter 64, we're going to go through it really quickly, is on mistreatment. And so, mistreatment is simply the harm or the threat of harm to an older person that is caused by another person. So, we're going to talk about abuse versus neglect. And unfortunately, mistreatment is often caused by family members. And older people often are discouraged from reporting it because they are, frail, more frail, and they have dependence on certain people. So abuse can be physical, sexual, psychological, or financial. So physical abuse is the use of harm or the threat of harm. Sexual abuse is sexual contact without consent by the use of force or threat of force. Psychological abuse is the use of words or actions to create emotional distress. And financial abuse is the exploitation of the person's possessions or funds. And then neglect is failure to provide food, drugs, personal care, or other necessities. Now, neglect can be intentional or unintentional. And so typically older people that are neglected or have been neglected, may appear malnourished, develop dry skin and dry mouth due to dehydration, or they may emit a body odor because they're not being cleaned. And then, how do you respond to this? So, a person should never assume that mistreatment is part of being older. Detecting it is hard because usually the older people like to hide it, or maybe they're trying to protect the person that's mistreating them. And so there are hotlines out there, such as the local area agency on aging, or the elder care locator, or the National Center on Elder Abuse. And these hotlines do provide resources for people who are being mistreated. And so some resources include medical treatment, education, psychological support, legal intervention, etc. So all of this information came out of the Merck manual. None of it was mine. And I hope y'all have a great day. Thank you.